this is a chapter from Revolutionary Rehearsals, and this is one of the last couple of chapters. We're going to do one more after this, but this is kind of fitting because it continued off kickoff I did a couple of months ago called Working Class Revolt Behind the Iron Curtain. So this kind of like builds off of that very nicely. So just a little bit of background. After World War II, the Soviet Union was on the winning side of the war, and they helped develop the Eastern Bloc. So regimes were established through communist parties in Eastern Bloc countries, and they took direction from Moscow. So these regimes, we're talking about East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria for the most part. While having communist symbolism and rhetoric, these were state capitalist countries that exploited their working class, as we'll see. Poland and the Eastern Bloc had a history of working class revolt and organized resistance. I'll talk about the church too. The church in Poland under the regime was formally banned or not acknowledged, but workers saw the church as supporting their communities and validating their antagonisms with the regime. So they had a unique relationship with the church. Barker refers to Poland's Communist Party as just simply the party throughout the chapters. So, when we're talking throughout this, I'll talk about Solidarity. I'll get into that in a moment. They're a union movement, but then we're also talking about the regime, or we would just call them the party, but it's essentially the Communist Party of Poland, which takes direction from Moscow. Here's just a map I'll point out some of the major cities we'll talk about. So a lot of the working class action we'll talk about in the beginning starts around Gdansk, which is a port city. So a lot of these coastal cities are very working class, but there's also, we'll talk about Bydgoszcz and Lublin and a couple others, but just wanted to kind of lay out a map for visual. So the intro section to the chapter, and I'll cover most of the sections in that chapter. Poland went from being an agricultural economy to the 10th biggest industrial power, and this is after World War II. The Polish working class in cities grew by the 70s. Working class struggles with the ruling class happened in 56, 70, and 76. From July 1980 to December 1981, Barker calls it the most advanced workers' movement of the post-war world. So he's talking about the Solidarity workers' movement. There was a crisis in the late 70s. It was the largest collapse of production yet seen in any post-war industrial country. There were a lot of debts owed to Western banks. Even in good times, there were inequalities, corruption, housing and food shortages, pollution, and health issues. West capitalist powers and state capitalist regimes in the Eastern Bloc both experienced these boom and bust cycles and class antagonisms. Solidarity continued, is the group we'll talk about, from Marxist politics because it showed the class antagonisms in the Eastern Bloc. It showed the power of the working class to organize itself for its emancipation and to be a beacon for all the other oppressed and exploited layers of class-divided society. The workers' movement became the real leadership. Even the most highly organized trade union movement could be crushed, though, because of a lack of political analysis and strategies. So that'll be a key thing that we'll talk about. Lighting the fuse. July 1980, there were food shortages and rising prices. This led to a wave of strikes across Polish industry for 6 weeks. But the strikes had built up over the previous years, and the regime was more compromising than militant. There were times when they came down hard with state repression, the police, but they saw that there was a lot of resistance to that. In 1970, the premier at the time, Gomulka, was brought down over workers' reaction to price rises. This caused riots and street battles, the burning of party buildings. There was also a resurgence of this again in 1976, but it just happened within 24 hours. The working class had developed confidence in its power to win concessions. There was no coordinating center, but an information network spreading news, demands, victories, and defeats. The Committee for the Defense of Workers, or KOR, was set up in 76. They played a role in publicizing the workers' movement. KOR brought together militant workers by sharing news, demanding free trade unions. Workers' circles developed rank and file leadership, shared advice on how to best organize, learning from their experiences. So like the experiences throughout the years, going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s. Some workers' demands at this time in July 1980 was higher wages, equal pay between families and the police, closure of special shops. So there were certain shops that you had to pay more to get specialty food items. They wanted a 5-day work week, new union elections, freedom of the press. And this was a transition of economic to more political demands. Explosion in Gdansk. KOR-inspired Workers' Circle was active in Gdansk, trying to organize workers, demonstrating, sharing a paper called The Coastal Worker. In August of 1980, Anna Walentinovich, a 50-year-old crane driver, was victimized and fired by management from the giant Lenin shipyards. The local Workers' Circle, in response to this, had meetings, prepared leaflets, posters, and demanded strike action. Lech Walesa, who we'll talk about a lot throughout this, he was I think in his late 30s at the time, and had previously been fired from the Lenin shipyards as well as other jobs. He announced he hopped over a fence, joined this this meeting, this kind of action that was happening, and he announced an occupation strike. So from this action, we'll see a lot of other pictures of him. He, from the beginning, kind of became a leader with this new movement. The Gdansk strike spread to nearby shipyards and coastal cities. Shipyard workers won pay increases, and Walentinovich and Walesa got their jobs back at the shipyards. Other workers who struck in solidarity, though, didn't gain anything from this. So those shipyard workers struck again to support the workers that had supported them in their to get the demands that they were pushing for. We saw the Inter-Enterprise Strike Committee formed for the first time. And this had delegates from all different striking workplaces in the region. They issued a 21 points, which was a set of more advanced demands. So some of those demands were new independent trade unions, relaxation of censorship, new rights for the church, freeing of political prisoners, and improvements in the health service. A newspaper called Solidarność was being circulated with up to 30,000 copies daily. The regime cut off communication from Gdansk, but the news still spread across Poland through a lot of these networks, KOR, and this strike committee. Inter-enterprise strike committees formed in other nearby cities. MKSs, that's the acronym, Polish acronym for these strike committees, forced the regime into negotiations, and the regime chose to go with negotiations with the MKSs, allowing some concessions. And then in that picture is Lech Walesa. Soviets in Poland. The whole movement was based on a huge wave of workplace occupations. Striking enterprises sent delegates to the local MKS, who reported back. Delegates elected an executive committee. Here's a quote: Polish workers are credited with the invention of the tactic of factory occupation. And Parker doesn't go into this, but I think he's referring to before the 30s. But he brings it up because it's coming back, something that they had done in the past. The Gdansk MKS took control of essential services. So they took over the trains, trucks, taxis, bakeries, food production. These were all under direction from the MKS. Alcohol production was halted. Thieves were subjected to proletarian justice, as they call it. So it was kind of like they had to stand in public and be booed and mocked by people for stealing. Polish workers were unknowingly reinvented from their own experience. Polish workers unknowingly reinvented from their own experience the Workers' Council form that was used in the Russian revolutions. And I thought it was coincidental that this is all happening around the shipyard that's named after Lenin. There was also a nearby shipyard called the Paris Commune shipyard. So I find that kind of interesting. The MKSs had the potential to develop into organs of revolutionary power and be the foundations of a new social order, but the Polish MKSs did not develop this way, and they consciously limited their aspirations. Some demands were toned down, such as around censorship and free elections in the Sejm, which is the Polish parliament. Advisors around leadership. There were advisors who were around leadership that advocated for compromising with the regime. We'll talk about them in a bit. Some religious figures called for an end to occupations. Militant workers, though, within it, the rank and file wanted to form their own independent trade unions. Here's a quote on the side. MKS was a strike committee of delegates from occupied workplaces, without regard to trade or industry, putting forward and fighting for political as well as economic demands, beginning to take control of aspects of production and distribution. This form improvised to handle the concrete problems of the struggle was also the organizational summary of bitterly won lessons from previous battles and an immense advance over previous modes of self-organization. Rising tide. 3 weeks after the Gdansk agreements, delegates met for the first national meeting representing 3 million workers. They named themselves NSZZ Solidarność, which means Independent Self-Governing Union Solidarity. So in Polish, Solidarność is solidarity. So I'll just refer to the group as Solidarity going forward. A provisional coordinating committee was formed to run the union between these meetings that they would have, and it was a centralized federation of Soviets, essentially. 80% of the Polish workforce eventually joined within weeks of the action. Solidarity pulled in workers from food shops, offices, cafes, lower ranked state employees, but not a majority of teachers. So this was moving beyond traditional just trade unions and into other types of work. Over the next 7 months, Solidarity continued to strike and grow, including organizations of students, peasants, prisoners, tenants organizations, journalists, actors, artists, writers, and more. They started to target the secret police and corruption in office. A dual power situation occurred in Poland at this time, where we saw two rival and incompatible forces contesting for the country's future. The regime held the levers of economic and political power, controlled the forces of repression, the secret police and the army, but they didn't have control over the people necessarily. And people were becoming more disillusioned. The regime tried to find ways to bring down Solidarity because they feared their influence. Neither side, though, was in a position to win outright. Crisis at Bydgoszcz, March 1981. This was the first time open force had been used against union members. Police beat up some Solidarity members, went in and started beating them up. 500,000 struck in response. A national strike was called in justice for the beatings and more. The national strike, if it was this is Barker saying, if it was a dress rehearsal for a full-scale general strike, it seemed the performance would be a success. The regime mobilized police in Bydgoszcz and threatened that the USSR might send forces. Jaruzelski, we'll talk about him later. He's a military leader, called on the church, specifically the Pope and the Cardinal, for support. And both the Pope and the Cardinal called for the strikes to halt. Walesa met secretly with the Cardinal and religious advisors and advocated for solidarity. While solidarity leaders were preparing for a national strike, Walesa was secretly negotiating with the regime. Walesa called off the strike on TV, which confused solidarity members, and many criticized him of being undemocratic. Bydgoszcz was a turning point. Solidarity would not be as united as before. So from about July is when this started at Gdansk. This is March, April, where we see kind of like a shift. And during that time, solidarity was really building up. So crisis and solidarity, the general strike's sudden cancellation was a serious setback. Solidarity gained little from the negotiations. After 9 months of a rising movement, workers' confidence was high, but after Bydgoszcz, there was a big demobilization of Solidarity's rank and file with feelings of confusion. The state's forces were shaky, divided, and uncertain. The Russian threat of sending in troops was present, but surprisingly not seen. So just on that real quick, this Russian threat, there's a history to this, and this is what I talked about in my other kickoff, is that in 1956, the USSR sent in troops to put down the workers' movement in Hungary, and then they did the same thing again in 1968 in Prague and Czechoslovakia. For the next 3 months, there was not a significant strike in Poland. The open democracy of the MKSs had been substituted with the dictatorship of a handful of national leaders and advisors. It was more than just a trade union, it had become a workers' movement. But now we see that solidarity had become bureaucratized and now moved in a new direction. Paralysis in the party. So we're talking about the Communist Party, the ruling party. The regime was still weak. The ruling party of Poland was officially called the Polish United Workers' Party. This party, though, was disconnected from the original Communist Party of Rosa Luxemburg. That party was mostly killed off in the 1930s. After the war, the party was built from above to pursue industrial development and capital accumulation. So the party's function was in running the state in a capitalist economy. Even in the name of being a workers' party, it was a party against the workers. The party operated to select and coordinate ruling personnel and transmit the rulers' plans into the communities and the workplace. Party members were given special awards at times, better jobs, access to valued commodities. So some of these specialty stores, they had access to them. So party members had it a little bit nicer. The ideological aspect of party doctrine eventually declined. The party at times promoted anti-Semitism, corruption was present, and criticism was not open or allowed. Solidarity's rise revealed the party's disconnect from the population and caused many party personnel to resign, be dismissed, be exposed in corruption, or leave to join Solidarity's ranks. The horizontalist movement was an attempt of the rank and file within the party to reform it. They tried to win free election of members instead of just being selected from above. And they tried to push the party closer to agreement with Solidarity. Their high point was around April 81. There was the Katowice Forum, where they were party hardliners who wanted tough action against Solidarity. So they were like the like Stalinists and didn't like what Solidarity was doing, obviously. The party's class character at the Congress in 1981 was mostly middle-aged, middle-class intellectuals, really lacking a presence of workers. And this is the Communist Party or the Workers' Party or whatever it's called. The outcome of, this is a quote from a worker. The outcome of the 9th Party Congress, hunger. The party was, as an effective mechanism of rule, was finished. After the Congress meeting, the center of government shifted away from the party towards the army. Solidarity's impasse. Both the regime and Solidarity were suffering from internal paralysis. The tragedy of Poland was that the forces of reaction, the regime, achieved theoretical and practical clarity before the workers' movement did. After the Congress, the regime militarized and developed an open offensive against the workers' movement. The last 8 months of Solidarity's existence featured no clear pattern of development, and different tendencies and movements came up. Some tried to sharpen Solidarity's radical politics. Modernization and bureaucratization within Solidarity. Many of Solidarity's leadership was moderate and wanted to continue a relationship with the regime, sometimes compromising and hoping to make advances at other times. The church hierarchy tried to influence Solidarity also. Cardinals and the Pope made calls to end strikes, and they preached for moderation with workers' actions. The church hierarchy was not necessarily obeyed by the workers, though, even though some of them may have been, diehard Catholics, true believers. They didn't all necessarily listen to the Pope in regards to some of these workers' issues. Many priests, though, so like not the cardinals or the Pope, but like the priests who were closer to the workers, tended to be, more unified with the workers, and they espoused, some of them, a more radical liberation theology and supported strikes and occupations. So this is kind of where if you look through pictures of this, you see a lot of pictures of a lot of people kind of like during like a Catholic mass, but within a workers' action. So there's a lot of that kind of overlap at times. Solidarity, though, was a mostly secular working class movement. The church hierarchy penetrated the leadership via the advisors. So advisors were intelligentsia. They were ex-members of the party. They were Catholic intellectuals, sometimes members of the KOR. They brought not so much the KOR, but these other groups mostly brought a more moderate liberal perspective, which they influenced the leaders of Solidarity and kind of, influenced Solidarity itself. Meetings began happening behind closed doors. Walesa was being influenced by advisors and becoming more moderate. Solidarity appealed to other classes, but risked becoming a popular front whose politics were determined by the intelligentsia, which became a class problem. The intelligentsia via the advisors had a profound influence on the inner politics of Solidarity, mixing Catholicism, nationalism, and liberalism. This caused Solidarity to play down its class character, with leaders avoiding talk of class antagonisms and workers' power. Walesa went into talks with Jaruzelski and the church without consulting members. So this is why he's being accused of being undemocratic. With bureaucracy and Solidarity came apathy from members. A reformist layer rose to the leadership. Radicals within Solidarity. Radical tendencies emerged in Solidarity. Sometimes this came from local cliques. They called out the regime as the new ruling class. Sometimes would reference Karl Marx and socialism ideology. Anna Walentinovich, so she was the 50-year-old crane driver who was kind of the where the Gdansk strike started. Was kind of around her issue being fired. Her and some other folks began openly criticizing Walesa for calling off the general strike and being undemocratic. They called for a rise in rank and file activity to weaken Walesa in the leadership. They were suspicious of the advisors and developed distrust of any ideology or theory, and were never able to form a political strategy to try to push Solidarity. Resurgent conflicts, economic crisis in spring and summer of '81 led to a reemergence of strikes. These were mostly wildcat strikes or not sanctioned by the union. This led to a wave of hunger marches and demonstrations in several cities. The leadership of Solidarity responded negatively, calling for a moratorium on strikes due to the economic crisis. So this is kind of why it's referred to as the self-limiting workers movement, that the leadership is putting down some of these strikes and calling for an end. Strikes continued in September and October of '81. These strikes saw new workers striking in response to conditions and frustration with the regime and called for solidarity to act. These strikes were fragmented, incoherent, and isolated from each other. No leadership attempted to link these different actions together. So there was an opportunity for solidarity leadership to kind of revive the movement, but they did not act. Radicals had nothing practical to offer. The strike wave died down in November, and solidarity membership was exhausted and disappointed. The regime prepares for war. After the Bydgoszcz crisis, the regime held military exercises to test its power against the workers' movement, but had not yet used force. The regime saw that political means was not defeating solidarity, so they turned towards the army. Jaruzelski rose to power in the regime, and by October and November, the regime had begun taking open offensive against solidarity activists and sending small army squads out into the country and into the factories, and really just to kind of be present and intimidate the workers or the peasants. In the Sejm, the parliament, there was discussion about the government taking martial law powers in case of emergencies. So we saw a lot of buildup here. And that's a picture of Jaruzelski. Final days, by late November, it was becoming obvious that a major confrontation was looming. The regime was preparing emergency powers legislation and putting army units in industrial centers. In December, students were involved in a major wave of occupations, including the Warsaw Firefighting School. The army claimed that this was within their sector, so they sent in the ZOMOs, which are the riot police, to surround the school. Crowds came to support the students, but the ZOMOs smashed in and kicked out the students. Solidarity's National Commission met in response to this because they were outraged. They declared the situation revolutionary, and they called for more strikes in a general strike in Gdansk. This was a shift to the left in Solidarity's leadership, but it was too late. The regime surrounded the commission with ZOMOs, and they arrested all the delegates. And then around the country, thousands of Solidarity activists were seized. Jaruzelski announced his military coup, the suspension of Solidarity and martial law just the next day. There were strikes and protests, but these were eventually put down by the coup. There was even like a strike by some miners that went on for like 3 weeks. And when they came out, they were surprised that there were no other strikes going on in support of them, and that there was no communication going on. And this is because all the leaders of Solidarity and a lot of the activists in the workers movement were being arrested. So there was kind of like a communication blackout. The relative success of Jaruzelski's coup depended on the demobilized condition of Solidarity's rank and file. Could it have been different? The deep structural antagonism between Poland's rulers and the workers' movement showed that confrontation was inevitable. Solidarity disorganized and demobilized its own side and didn't try to weaken the other side. Over 16 months, Solidarity started as a free trade union, demanded worker control of industry, demanded a self-governing republic, began to turn towards specifically political solutions to the crises that were happening. Solidarity's leadership had a classic reformist perspective and restrained the movement from considering the overthrow of the state. They did not take opportunities to fight back on, especially at the end. A socialist tendency within Solidarity could have made a difference in promoting the idea of Polish workers preparing to take power. None of the radicals in Solidarity grasped the issues within its leadership, challenged the advisors, engaged in later strikes, made organizational conclusions and criticisms of the leadership by working to build a radical faction rooted in the militant tendencies within the rank and file. So we didn't see any of this happen within Solidarity. A revolutionary socialist current within Solidarity would not have been easy and would have had to win some hard arguments. The Russians never intervened in Poland as they did in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, most likely since it was weakening and didn't want the negative attention of sending in tanks again. The threat of Russian invasion was used by both sides to prevent worker action. A Polish workers' victory would have depended on spreading the movement outside of Poland too. So this is where it gets into like the international aspect, is that a Polish workers' victory would not be enough on its own. It would need to win support in other countries to have a system of support and defense against its enemies. Poland didn't receive as much support from the Eastern Bloc, which helped to isolate and conservatize Solidarity. Here's another quote, I think my last quote. At present, Polish militants are cut off practically and theoretically from the best traditions of the left in the rest of the world. The fact that the regime has monopolized and utterly perverted the language of socialism and Marxism makes the recovery and development of a viable tradition even more difficult. Some final thoughts. Solidarity was formed by workers during the struggle who had learned lessons from previous struggles. They had learned to self-organize and were working towards self-emancipation. Since Solidarity developed in a so-called communist country in the Eastern Bloc, they were given a distorted version of what socialism was and what it looked like. A revolutionary socialist current would have had to combat misconceptions of socialism. If Solidarity developed more cadre, real socialist ideas could have driven the workers' movement. Solidarity developed into a bureaucracy, just as some movements before it had, such as in Russia. For socialists, we need to understand how Solidarity worked, but also how it failed. This is why we as socialists would have to make hard arguments against reformism, Stalinism, bourgeois politics in revolutionary situations.